Is Turkey's long-running war against the Kurdistan Workers Party, the PKK, finally over? For 40 years, the country has waged a bitter and brutal conflict against the group, a battle that's led to more than 40,000 deaths. Yet there's now a hope that the insurgency could finally be drawing to a close. So, what exactly has happened, and could this really be the moment that Turkey's Kurdish conflict genuinely ends? Protracted insurgencies rarely end cleanly. Unlike interstate wars, which usually conclude with a surrender, a ceasefire, or a formal peace treaty, internal conflicts fought over identity and political rights are often far harder to resolve. They usually fade in and out of resolution as ceasefires collapse and political leaders change their minds. Peace processes that seem irreversible one year can unravel entirely the next, either because of disagreements over the terms of the deal or because underlying grievances aren't addressed. All this has come to the fore with the latest effort to resolve the PKK insurgency in Turkey. While the conflict has already produced ceasefires and at least one major peace process, that collapsed back into open warfare after just 2 years. And yet, there's now hope that a new process may at long last bring the conflict to a close. Straddling Europe and the Middle East, Turkey has roughly 85 million people. With a large Kurdish minority concentrated in its southeastern provinces bordering Iraq and Syria, estimates suggest Kurds make up somewhere between 15 and 20% of the overall population, thus making them Turkey's largest ethnic minority. As well as identity differences, the southeast, where the insurgency has traditionally been most intense, has historically lagged behind the rest of the country economically. And it's this factor that's long fed into Kurdish grievances about marginalisation from the Turkish state. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the founding of the modern Turkish Republic in the 1920s. From the outset, the new country adopted an explicitly Turkish understanding of the state. Seeking to assimilate most of the country's minorities, it left little formal space for Kurdish identity and language, let alone political expression. As a result, Kurdish uprisings occurred sporadically throughout the 20th century. However, the current phase of the conflict began in 1984 when Abdullah Öcalan founded the PKK, launched an armed insurgency aimed at creating an independent Kurdish state. Within just a few years, what had started as a small insurgency in the rural parts of the southeast became a major conflict that had spread into the region's towns and even into Turkey's major cities, where the PKK carried out terror attacks. At the same time, the group established bases across the border in northern Iraq, which in turn became vital safe havens for the organisation. While the conflict continued throughout the 1990s, the critical turning point came in 1999 when Abdullah Öcalan was captured. Although he no longer commanded the group on the ground, he continued to shape its political direction from his jail cell in Turkey. This led the PKK to eventually abandon its demands for full statehood and instead pursue greater autonomy and political rights. All the while, the Turkish government, led by Prime Minister and then President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, began experimenting with limited concessions. These included greater Kurdish language rights and the legalisation of Kurdish language broadcasting and education. All this eventually paved the way for a serious attempt at a comprehensive settlement in 2013. While this produced a ceasefire and a broader political process, this all collapsed just 2 years later in 2015, plunging the southeast back into conflict and prompting many to question whether any future initiative could ever succeed. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, can I ask you to perhaps take a second to give the video a like and perhaps subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Many thanks. And now, back to the video. So, more than a decade later, what's led to the hopes that the conflict may now be ending? The current process began in late 2024 under surprising circumstances when the leader of the extreme right-wing Nationalist Movement Party and one of the PKK's fiercest opponents, suggested that Öcalan could address the Turkish parliament and announce that the group would cease to exist. Just months later, in February 2025, Öcalan called on the PKK to disarm and dissolve. This was followed by a formal congress of the group in May to confirm the decision and a symbolic weapons burning ceremony in northern Iraq. While momentum stalled amid regional instability linked to the war with Iran, it resumed again in the summer of 2026. In a landmark move, on the 10th of August, Turkish MPs overwhelmingly passed far-reaching legislation to end the conflict, the so-called Framework Law. In return for established processes to verify the PKK's disarmament, it set up a way to provide conditional pardons for thousands of the group's former fighters. Crucially, just over a week later, on the 18th of August, President Erdoğan signed the plan into law. So, will this really lead to peace? On the one hand, there are strong reasons to suggest that this time is genuinely different. Unlike the 2013 to 2015 process, which relied largely on informal closed-door understandings between the PKK and the Turkish government, this initiative has produced actual legislation backed by a cross-party coalition that notably includes former hardliners such as the MHP. Moreover, the creation of a defined legal mechanism to verify that disarmament has really happened, along with a promise of amnesty for fighters, suggests a far deeper and broader political commitment than the last effort. Meanwhile, the PKK has seemingly demonstrated its commitment to the process by formally voting to dissolve as an organisation and by symbolically burning its weapons in public. This appears to go well beyond merely declaring a ceasefire that could later be reversed. But while all these factors are certainly important and seemingly meaningful, many argue that the fundamentals underpinning the conflict remain unresolved. Öcalan is still in prison, and the PKK has been clear that unless he's released, the process can't be seen as a true settlement. On top of all this, critics argue that the agreement fails to guarantee that returning fighters can engage freely in Kurdish democratic politics without facing fresh prosecution. In this sense, many argue that as long as the legislation fails to address broader demands for expanded Kurdish political and cultural rights, and Öcalan remains imprisoned, it'll simply push the conflict's core disputes down the road rather than resolve them. But concern over the deal's future goes beyond fears that it doesn't address Kurdish wishes. Many ordinary Turks are also worried about the agreement, and this may yet grow. Indeed, Turkish public backing for the initiative has been steadily declining. Over the course of 2025, polling showed that overall support fell from the low 60s into the 50s. This could drop further if people feel that Kurdish fighters are being treated too leniently, or that the concessions that are being made to the Kurds are too great. With Erdogan's support waning, many believe his motives are more electoral than sincere. He could do with support from Kurdish voters, but conversely, others are sceptical about the government's commitment to the process. If the measures are too unpopular, will he then turn his back on them? And it's for all these reasons that most Turks seem to doubt whether the Kurdish issue will in fact come to an end within the next decade. Ultimately, while the recent moves undoubtedly mark an important and welcome step forward, any optimism should be tempered with a degree of caution. On a positive note, if the disarmament verification process now underway is completed smoothly and Ankara follows through on the legal and political reforms that many Kurds seek, the process could well mark the end of one of the world's longest-running insurgencies. That said, if history is any guide, protracted conflicts rarely end with a single piece of legislation, no matter how significant. Instead, they require much more. Legislation is one thing. What matters is that it's implemented, trust is built, and broader calls for political and social reform, as well as economic development, translate into real change. For all these reasons, the question now is whether Turkey has in fact finally broken its cycle of violence by ending its long-standing conflict with the PKK and will now address broader Kurdish concerns, or whether this latest effort will be yet another false start. I hope you found that useful. If so, here's another video that you might find interesting. Many thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.